About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and culture, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items, and I'll answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. So far in these programs, we've learned that although the medical world defines consciousness as what we're aware of in the moment, most of what goes on in our minds is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in unconscious processes. From 100 years ago, when Jung and Freud and other early researchers began this field, we learned that our minds can be thought of as having three aspects. What we are aware of, which is usually called the conscious mind. What we aren't aware of that keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and our beliefs about threats and dangers, which we're calling the subconscious mind. And what we aren't aware of that connects us and guides us in our actions, what we're calling the superconscious. We then learned that we can change our state of consciousness and shift which aspects of mind we're aware of and what we're capable of. From neuroscientists, we learned that the brain modifies whatever it receives from both the body senses and from the mind to fit the past patterns of experience, which follows Begg's principle that neurons that fire together wire together, and they form a default network in the brain. This means that we see, hear, and feel what we expect to, or what we believe we will experience. We also learned that while it's possible to say where in the brain various processes are active, no one has yet been able to pinpoint where memories are stored, or how ideas and thoughts are formed. We then saw that many responses in our body happen faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel through the body, and they often happen before we are aware of it. And some experiments have demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead. As a result, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the brain, but is in fact the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the whole body. The brain, then, is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving information from the senses and transmitting those to the body and the mind. Now, the mind appears to be at least partly electromagnetic because it's possible to measure electromagnetic activity associated with thoughts and imaginings for several inches and sometimes several feet around the body. And some researchers and teachers of ancient traditions, who we call shamans or yogis, say that field looks like a glowing egg shape extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists regardless of whether the body is functioning. It permeates and develops with the body and the brain, and it is fed information through the brain. Now, every field is a unique pattern of vibration that's different from other fields, and some experiments have demonstrated that minds can vibrate along similar patterns. They resonate with each other. When they do this, their bodies have been observed to change when someone they're connected with, they resonate with, turns attention their way, even though they can't be seen or heard. We've learned also that mind affects energy and matter in a variety of other ways. For example, in the famous double-slit experiments in quantum physics, where the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter, depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. For decades now, individuals have changed the patterns of numbers in what should be random grids on their computer screens or printouts, and the collective human mind changes the readouts from random number generators on the network of computers that's run by the Global Consciousness Project in Princeton. Because of the nature of fields, and because of things like the Global Consciousness Project, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual mind as part of a larger field, what Jung called a collective consciousness. Teilhard de Chardin called it a noosphere. Others call it a global brain. And more scientists are equating this mind with the quantum or zero-point field, out of which all matter and energy arise. Some are even calling it the Akashic field, which is using a Sanskrit term that means the essence of everything that exists in the material world. We've also heard from researchers who are using the mathematical equations describing quantum mechanics, relativity, and computer learning algorithms to describe a role that consciousness plays in the formation of matter. Based on these understandings, we could explore some popular ideas about consciousness, including the famous law of attraction, how the world around us mirrors what our consciousness has been focusing on, how we can access information in the quantum or Akashic field through insight, intuition, and channeling, how dreams affect the body and our greater consciousness, how music affects the body and the brain and our connections with other fields of mind, how our state of consciousness affects the healing process, and the belief in a treatment can help a patient experience healing, and the placebo effect, and how we can enhance or slow down healing through our thoughts, emotions, and visualizations. We looked at how remote viewing and telekinesis work, and how we can get into a state of flow in which the mind and the brain are in sync and maximize our effectiveness. You can catch up on these past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips and books and authors that I mention on each show. Now, in our last episode, we focused on the way that scientific analysis of what are usually called paranormal experiences is an integration of the two hemispheres of the brain, bringing the focused analytical left brain into alignment with and correspondence with the holistic relational activity of the right brain. The question comes up, how does someone start doing such a thing? And, well, it turns out it's pretty much the same way virtually everything happens in most people's lives. Last week, we listened a lot to Dean Radin, one of the most powerful statistical analysts of paranormal experiences, having written several books comparing thousands of studies and analyzing them statistically. I'm going to let him explain his own experience of coming into this process.
I don't even remember how we learned our mutual interests, but at some point, something about remote viewing came up and he expressed an interest. And so we started doing informal experiments on remote viewing, and we're getting some interesting results on it. So through him, I was introduced to a couple of other professors who also had more or less secret interests. So as a graduate student, I started dabbling in these sorts of things. And as a result, eventually discovered that there were journals, that there were organizations, that were other people out there doing it. And then I discovered in the library stacks at the University of Illinois, way down in like the 5th sub-basement, there was a huge section on parapsychology. Like all of the books and journals that you would expect to find in a really good library. And I spent a fair amount of time there just exploring the idea that a lot of people for a long time have been spending serious effort looking at these kinds of phenomena.
So he just happened to hang out with someone who was interested, and they started dabbling. I think that's marvelous. Charles Tart, another scientist whom we heard from earlier in this show, also came through the back door, so to speak, and I'll let him tell you how that worked.
If I have to think to the deeper reasons as to why I'm interested in consciousness and parapsychology and the like, it's because of a conflict I had as a teenager, which I think is actually one an awful lot of people have had, between the religion you're raised in and then you discover science and modern thought and so forth. I was raised as a Lutheran, and my grandmother took me to church. Grandmothers are unconditional love. It was good enough for her. It was good enough for me. But then I started thinking for myself as I became a teenager. Like a lot of teenagers, I started noticing the hypocrisy of the adults around me. So those people who went to church, those grown-ups, were not practicing what they preached. But I was exposed to science, too, and realized that science seemed to say that a lot of this religious stuff was nonsense. And I was feeling a considerable conflict there. Now, when I look at what's happened to a lot of my friends and a lot of other people, usually two things happen. They go in the direction of sort of jumping all the way to what they think is the science side, and religion is all nonsense, forget about it. Or they kind of psychologically compartmentalize. They'll think about religion on Sunday for a couple of hours and not think about it the rest of the week, and so not experience the conflict. I don't think in retrospect that either one of those is a completely healthy reaction. I was lucky because I was a voracious reader, and I discovered the books on psychical research and parapsychology in which people had gone through the same kind of conflict long before me and said, okay, let's use the basic scientific method to try to refine stuff in the area of religion and spirituality. Let's separate the wheat from the chaff. And I found that inspiring, and basically that's what I've been working at most of the rest of my life, trying to separate out with a kind of open-minded science what's real and essential about the kind of stuff we call in the spiritual direction, and what is indeed superstition or outmoded cultural stuff we can leave behind.
So Charles Tart had that experience of, oh, wait a minute, those things don't make sense. And then he, too, discovered there is a whole lot of work that's been being done for a long time. There is another way, though, that people come into this. And I'm going to let Helene Wabi, who we heard from quite a while ago when we were talking about channeling, explain her experience.
I'm a naturopathic physician, and I've been in private practice for a number of years and have been focused on mind-body medicine. I'm also a meditation teacher and have been teaching meditation for over a decade. I have a master's in clinical research, and I ran numerous clinical studies for over a decade before coming to IONS. In that decade, I worked with combat veterans with PTSD, stressed older adults, and dementia caregivers. I got a grant from the National Institute of Health on how mindfulness meditation works. In the lab, I've stressed people, I've relaxed people, I've collected measures like pupil dilation, blood pressure, brain waves, heart waves, skin conductance. I've collected saliva, blood, and urine. I've been on governmental grant panels and institutional review boards. I've written numerous papers and presented at conferences internationally. So why am I telling you all this? Besides, of course, to establish my credibility as a scientist. Well, nowhere in my academic background is there anything about channeling. So how did I end up standing here today to promote a channeling research program? What's the connection? Well, what you wouldn't know from looking at me is that I come from a long line of channels. I actually went to my first seance when I was 10 years old at my grandparents' house. You also wouldn't know that every single member of my mother's family has channeling ability, from my grandmother, who surprised everybody by going into a full trance at 15 years old, to my uncle, who was tested for psychokinetic skills at John F. Kennedy University and channeled a book through automatic writing, to my mom, who you'll get to experience today.
So unlike the gentlemen who were trained in the sciences and then discovered that this other stuff existed and had been being researched for a long time, Helene grew up in a world where accessing information through other than our direct perceptual framework, other than our focused concentration, was part of her regular, normal life. She went on to study the sciences, but in the context of knowing that there is a lot more to what we are experiencing than the sciences encourage us to believe. One way to understand the process of bringing the primarily left brain scientific method to the primarily right brain experiences of expanded consciousness is that while we're focusing on the science, life pulls us into more complete and balanced use of capabilities, hence the field of Noetics. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, and how our lives could be better if we understood it more fully. I'm Ruth Miller, and that sound tells me we need to look at, well, a book about what we've been talking about, what's going on in the world today, and what you, the listeners, are curious about. To explore this topic further, I decided once again to review a site with a list of books rather than an individual title. Now, the site we're going to look at today is called My All-Time Top 10 Books on Intuition. It's uploaded and maintained by Jan L. Bowen. And what she says is accurate. Quote, "There are countless ways to develop and strengthen your intuition. Reading, studying, and applying the knowledge within excellent books on the subject is one of them." And then she goes on, "Intuition is an innate human ability we all possess, rather than a gift bestowed upon a lucky few. The gift of intuition is that it unlocks an ease that instills a clarity to life." I really like that. Well, the first book she has on her list is called Second Sight. It's by Judith Orloff, and she's done a lot of work, Judith has, with empaths over decades. And on the site, Jan Bowen tells us this classic is well worth a place in every library focused on intuitive development. She says Dr. Orloff, a psychiatrist and intuitive, brings both science and experience to the discussion. Her second book on this site, My All-Time 10 Books on Intuition, is one of the first that was made known to the larger world back in the 1960s. And this is Creative Visualization by Shakti Gawain, Gawain. There is no way of getting around it, the website says. To strengthen intuitive ability, meditation is necessary. Call it anything you like, but stilling your mind is required to hear intuitive input. The classic, she says, Creative Visualization, is the one I found most useful. She says it validated what I was spontaneously experiencing. Yep. And then Shakti Gawain wrote a second book, which is on this list, Living in the Light. And it explains, that book, I'm going to say, explains how it is that as we're developing our intuition, we begin to unlock things we were uncomfortable with or have led us to be uncomfortable, and we can make choices. And she explains how, as the website here says, she explains not only why it's necessary, but also how to move through that discomfort so we can return to the intuitive clarity. Her third book is called Trust Your Vibes, Secret Tools for Sixth Sensory Living by Sonia Choquette. Again, back in the 70s and 80s, Choquette, which is spelled Choquette, was a very powerful empowerer for those of us who are beginning to understand this. In this book, this website says she provides specific tools and also shares stories and experiences that are both encouraging and motivating for intuitive development. Her next book on this website is Lynn McTaggart's the field. Now, we've talked about Lynn, and maybe we'll talk about her some more, but she's talking about this larger quantum field that is what many people believe is our mind, all integrated from all sources in one mind. And the website is describing the book, The Field, The Quest for the Secret Force of the Universe, which Lynn McTaggart wrote very soon after contributing to the movie The Secret. On the site, the author says, Lynn McTaggart applies science in an attempt at explaining our world and its apparent inexplicable mysteries. She says there is important data in here. Different authors have different approaches, and it's useful. The next book on this list is by Laura Day, another very important teacher from the 70s and 80s, practical intuition in various applications. And this particular book is How to Rule the World from Your Couch. The author on the site says, one of the reasons I appreciate her is that she is practical, and this book delivers once again. Intuition can sometimes have the impression and reputation of being mystical, and while it may be that, it's also an inherent ability. Miss Day eloquently presents ways to develop these skills in daily life. Her next book is by another author that we've talked about, Penny Peirce, Peirce. I talked about her book Frequency. This book is The Intuitive Way, the definitive guide to increasing your awareness. Now, Miss Peirce has written primarily for the corporate world, and the website says Ms. Peirce provides a full course in this book and encourages you heartily to follow it. Her tools are excellent and her applications are practical. The next book on here is by Inna Segal, S-E-G-A-L, The Secret Language of Your Body. And the website says, our bodies are like antennae receiving messages constantly. Interpreting all the input can be a learning process. So she's seeing our right brain input, that aspect of the full mind that enters into our awareness through primarily the right hemisphere, being from the body. And that actually can be understood if you're familiar with the Course in Miracles, which describes the body as a feedback mechanism for what the mind is doing. So the mind includes the super and subconscious as well as our current awareness, and the mind is experienced in the brain primarily through the right hemisphere and then translated through the left as we focus on things, or through the feedback mechanism of the body. So this is The Secret Language of Your Body by Inna Segal. The next book on her list is marvelous. It's Joe Dispenza's Becoming Supernatural, How Common People Are Doing the Uncommon. This isn't specifically on developing intuition, she says. It focuses on our total human potential, of which intuition is one aspect. And yes, indeed, Joe Dispenza does help us develop our whole potential in all of his books. Her next book is called How to Hear What You Know, Developing Your Intuition to Practically Guide You Through Life. This is by Jan Bowen, B-O-W-E-N. The book is a course itself, the website says, with self-directed exercises and outlines. Chapters include overcoming blocks, developing a method for listening, and trusting what you hear. Now again, we've said that our individual mind is part of the larger mind, which includes all knowledge everywhere. So what we're doing in this book is we're learning to expand our current personal awareness to include what the full mind has to offer. Jan L. Bowen's website, My Top 10 Books on Intuition, seemed to me to be a useful resource for you, and the link is included in the website, noeticmoments.org. Well, guess what? We're out of time again for today. That's it for today's show. But remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of the titles and other resources we refer to on the show, along with archived past shows, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to answer the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. Have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.